as we are looking at some last moments in the earthly ministry of Jesus leading up to the cross. We find ourselves in Matthew 26, verse 57. Then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered. And Peter was following him at a distance as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and going inside he sat with the guards to see the end. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus that they might put him to death. But they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. At last, two came forward and said, "This man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days. And the high priest stood up and said, Have you no answer to make? What is this that these men testify against you? But Jesus remained silent. And the high priest said to him, I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus said to him, You have said so. But I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his robes and said, He has uttered blasphemy. What further witnesses do we need? You have now heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment? They answered, He deserves death. You cannot fully understand or appreciate the cross unless you understand what took place the day he was tried and crucified. Listen to what one legal expert said, and I quote, The trial of Jesus Christ represents the darkest day in the history of jurisprudence. The man that was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death was the only perfect and completely innocent person who ever lived. Yet he was declared guilty of crimes he never committed. Then he was sentenced to the most painful form of capital punishment ever devised. Now here's the background. Jesus was taken around 2 a.m. before Annas, who used to be the high priest. Now that in and of itself was illegal because the law stated that if you were to be accused of a crime, you could never be interrogated alone, and yet he was taken to Annas according to John chapter 18. They met one-on-one. And then around 3 a.m. he was taken to Annas' son-in-law, Caiaphas, the high priest's house, to be further interrogated. Now the Sanhedrin that had gathered in the house that early morning was the highest court of Israel. They were like our Supreme Court. There were 70 members on the court. And if you were brought before them, it was a very serious matter. They didn't come together for jaywalking. Only the most serious of crimes and the most dangerous of criminals were brought before the Sanhedrin. And even though it was to be a court of justice, you will find it was anything but. Although Lady Justice is supposed to be blindfolded, on this morning the blindfolds were off. It was going to become obvious that, legally speaking, Jesus didn't stand a chance before this court. The president or chief priest of the Sanhedrin was named Caiaphas. Now, as chief priest, when he gathers the Sanhedrin, he would say, We've got someone on trial for his life, and I want to remind you how valuable life is, so we must be careful in how we handle this. We don't want to take any life lightly or unjustly. He was to be an advocate for the defendant, defending his rights. But in verse 57, it says, Then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered. Keep in mind, it's about 3 a.m. Isn't it interesting that some 71 men have assembled in the darkness of night in someone's house? They're not there for justice sake. They're not there to conduct a trial. They're there to first nail Jesus to the wall before they nail him to the cross. But it gets worse. In Luke 22, verse 54, it tells us that Jesus was not just led to Caiaphas, he was led to Caiaphas' house. What was the problem with that? Well, the law was specific. The Sanhedrin was not to meet outside their hall of judgment, like our Supreme Court building today. They had no jurisdiction outside the Temple Mount. The law also stated that a trial such as this was not allowed to be held in private, but only in public. Another problem was that if the case involved the death penalty, it had to be conducted in broad daylight over a 2-day period so that the trial was thorough and just because a life is at stake. Since the Jewish day began at sundown, Jesus was tried, convicted, condemned, and crucified within a 24-hour period, totally against the law. Now it gets worse. Look at verse 59. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus that they might put him to death. You say, what's wrong with that? Well, you've got the judges acting as the prosecuting attorneys. It's not their job to try the case, but only to hear the case. And they're not looking for witnesses, but false witnesses. It's as though they were saying, we've got our minds made up, don't confuse us with the facts. Now, the court can only try cases where an independent source was to bring the accusation. But since no one came forth, they went out to find some false witnesses. Legally, this trial should have been stopped. Look at verse 60. But they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. At last, 2 came forward. How many of you have ever testified in a trial? Witnesses are not allowed to hear one another's testimonies. Why? They want to make sure that the testimony presented is independent and not in collusion. But it gets worse. Look at verse 61. At last, 2 came forward and said, this man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days. The problem here is that they contradicted their testimonies. The Gospel of Mark tells us in Mark 14, verse 55, now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree. And some stood up and bore false witness against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another, not made with hands. Yet even about this, their testimony did not agree. There were 2 problems with their testimonies. First, if you read what Jesus said originally, he did not say what the false witnesses said. And secondly, Jesus said, I'm not talking about this temple, I'm talking about this temple, speaking of himself. Mark said they contradicted each other. If you've got one witness saying one thing and another witness saying another thing, and you can't tell who's telling the truth in a court of law, what do? You throw it all out. Well, they didn't do that. Instead, look at what they did in verse 62. And the high priest stood up and said, have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you? Well, what's wrong with that? Well, Jesus didn't get a chance to introduce witnesses or evidence on his behalf. Only, what do you have to say about what these people are saying about you? It was totally illegal. And then verse 63. But Jesus remained silent, and the high priest said to him, I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. Jesus said to him, you have said so, but I tell you from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his robes and said, he has uttered blasphemy. What further witnesses do we need? If this doesn't get any deeper or any worse, watch this. The high priest renders his verdict first, and then he proclaims there's no need to proceed with the trial. We've heard everything we need to hear. Even though the high priest knows, according to the law, that the defendant has a right to defend himself, even that was not the greatest problem. Look at verse 66. What is your judgment? They answered. He deserves death. According to Jewish law and the legal code of the Sanhedrin, in any case, especially capital crime, you had to vote one at a time and start with the least member of the court and proceed to the highest members of the court. Why? Well, they didn't want the younger guys intimidated or unduly influenced by the older guys. And the guy that voted last, not first, according to their code, was the high priest. And if they found a man guilty of death, they had to go home and spend an entire day thinking about the verdict because a man's life was at stake. And then come back a day later to reaffirm that the death penalty was the proper verdict. So at every point of the trial of Jesus, he could have said, unfair, unfair, not right, unjust, unjust. That's not what you hear. Here's what I want you to see. If the Son of God was treated unfairly, you will be too. That's just the way it is. That's just how life works. Whenever something unfair happens to you, whenever life gives you a raw deal, whenever something happens and the first thing that pops up in your mind is that's not fair, that's not right, that's not just. You know what God's looking for? What God's asking you? How are you going to respond to that? The reason people get bitter is because they get obsessed with what people have done to them. And they focus on what's been done to them. There are those here today, and you're eaten up with bitterness because of what someone has done to you 1 year, 5 years, 20 years ago. What you don't understand is that all this time God's been saying to you, what will be your response? Look at how you're responding. It's not what's happened to you, but how are you going to respond? When life isn't fair, you can trust God to do what's right. So 2 things I want you to write down. Number 1, when life isn't fair, the number 1 thing you do is trust God. Trust God. Verse 62, and the high priest stood up and said, have you no answer to make? What is it these men testify against you? Now that blows my mind. His life is on the line. Here's his chance. Okay, Jesus, defend yourself. Take your shot. At that moment, Jesus could have shut that trial down. And what does he say? Nothing. Why didn't he respond? What would most of us have done in that situation? First of all, Jesus had some legal reasons why he didn't respond. Jesus had been arraigned but never indicted. He had no legal reason to testify. He also knew nothing he said would change the minds of those running this kangaroo court. This is a done deal. Why waste my breath? Every witness brought against him had proved to be false, and the law stated that a man could only be put to death on the basis of 2 witnesses independently testifying apart from the other with evidence provided where there is no doubt. And that didn't happen. Jesus was silent. Besides, if he spoke, it would give credibility to the proceedings when there was nothing but a show, nothing but a sham. So Jesus was silent. Listen, I know what it's like. I've been where some of you are right now. When someone slaps you in the face and you don't deserve it. When someone slams you unfairly. When someone says something about you that's not true. The hardest thing in the world to do is to say nothing. It's so hard not to fire back. But listen, when someone slaps you or slams you or slanders you or accuses you unfairly, if you know that your heart's right and your motives are right and your conduct is right and your character is right, the best thing to do is say nothing. D.L. Moody once said, if you will take care of your character, God will take care of your reputation. You do know the difference, don't you? Reputation is what somebody says you are. Character is what God knows that you are. If you know somebody's out to get you and they're not going to listen to you no matter what you say, don't say a thing. But there was a more important reason why Jesus was silent. And it wasn't just for legal reasons. There was a spiritual reason. In 1 Peter chapter 2, if I can get to it. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. So, and while being reviled, he did not revile in return, but entrusting himself. Jesus knew he was right. Jesus knew he had done nothing wrong. Jesus knew he was in the middle of the Father's will. Jesus knew. So do you know what he said? Father, I'm just going to trust you in this. It's not my problem. It's your problem. Even though Jesus knew he was about to go through hell and go to hell, he kept his eyes on heaven. Even though everybody in that courtroom hated him, he knew his Father loved him. Even though everybody around him had abandoned him, he knew heaven was still on his side. He said, I'm going to trust my Father. But there's one more thing I want you to see. Ecclesiastes 3:7 says there is a time to be silent and a time to speak. So there's one other thing you need to do when life is unfair and you're put on trial. Not only should you trust God, but secondly, you must tell the truth. Listen to verse 63. But Jesus remained silent, and the high priest said to him, I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. Now everything's changed. When the high priest said, I adjure you by the living God, he was putting Jesus under oath, and legally Jesus had to respond. He said, I'm telling you, and I want to know, and we want to hear it, are you the Christ, the Son of the living God? Now you talk about God being in control and in charge behind the scenes. The high priest had unwittingly put Jesus in a situation where he was not only legally obligated to respond, but he got to say what those men needed to hear. He got to speak the truth. After all, this is the key question, even still to this day. Are you the Christ? Are you the promised one? Are you the Messiah? Are you the Son of God? Are you the Savior of the world? He asked the right question, and boy, does Jesus ever take advantage of telling the truth. Look at verse 64. Jesus said to him, you have said so, but I tell you from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. That little phrase there, you have said so, or you said it yourself, was an idiom used back in those days simply to say, yeah, you're right, just like you said it. Yes, I am. Yes, I am the Messiah, the Son of God, the Christ. Now listen, everyone in that courtroom then, and everyone in this courtroom today, has to make a decision. Do you believe he is who he said he is? And then what are you going to do about it? Are you going to receive him or reject him? Either Jesus was guilty of blasphemy and innocent of being deity, or Jesus was innocent of blasphemy and guilty of being deity. In other words, either Jesus was a blasphemer and he was not God, or he was not a blasphemer and he is God. There still has not been one witness or one piece of evidence to convict Jesus of anything. To this minute, they took their best shot and emptied their clip, and they hadn't laid a glove on him. Do you know why? Because he was exactly who he said he was. Therefore, it is one of the strongest pieces of evidence in all of Scripture that he was who he said he was. Because if anybody, anywhere, anytime, at any place was going to find fault with Jesus, it was then, it was there, and they couldn't do it. So in closing, look at verse 66 again, the beginning of that verse. What is your judgment? In other words, what is your decision? And I want you to think about, what is your decision? Have you decided to follow Jesus, or have you rejected Jesus? Today I pray that you will come clean before the Lord and let him save you and make you one of his own and give your life to Christ today.